Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you and the one clear truth that emerges from it. In this issue, we will focus on Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is entering his fourth year of his second term. And we will look at the performance of his government and him, and what are the big tasks and challenges ahead for the Modi government. But before we get into the details, let me highlight a few interesting facts that has a bearing on Mr. Modi's performance. In October 7th last year, Mr. Modi completed a major landmark. It signaled 20 years of his being head of governments, an uninterrupted stint where for 12 and a half years he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, making him one of the longest serving Chief Ministers of that state, and for the next 8 years as Prime Minister of India. Now, other Chief Ministers like the former Chief Minister of West Bengal, the late Jyoti Basu, and the former Chief Minister of Sikkim, Pawan Kumar Chamling, had completed 20 years. But Mr. Modi has that rare combination of being not only a Chief Minister and a Prime Minister for long periods of time. This unique mix of experience and perspective have helped Mr. Modi deal with some of the most complex problems with a great deal of aplomb. No leader in recent times has faced the kind of multiple crises that Mr. Modi had to deal with at the beginning of his second term and continues to deal with right now. To meet each of these challenges, Mr. Modi brought his own unique style of management. For those who know Mr. Modi well, they see an element of continuity between Modi 1.0 and Modi 2.0. For instance, he continues to be a very good listener. While taking a decision, he listens to a whole host of opinion and calls in experts. But once he makes up his mind, he executes the decision quickly and stays with it. But there are major differences in Modi 2.0. He seems to have overcome many of the hesitancies that he had during his first tenure and has moved quickly to bring out radical reform in key sectors. But Mr. Modi seemed as a man in a great hurry when he was sworn in as Prime Minister for the second time on May 30th, 2019. He went ahead almost immediately with a series of radical steps that changed India and also had huge impact on the world. The first big step that Prime Minister Modi took in his second term was in August 2019, when he stunned Pakistan and the world by abrogating Article 370. Article 370 gave Jammu and Kashmir an autonomy that few other Indian states enjoyed. And by removing this article, he ended once and for all the ambiguity and the dispute over the status of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir had now, and as in the past, become an integral part of the Indian state. I would consider abrogating Article 370 as important or probably on par with the decision that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi took in 1974 when she gave clearance for India's first nuclear test. And also in 1998, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee gave clearance for the 5 nuclear tests and declared that India was a nuclear weapon state. Because abrogating Article 370 and ending that ambiguity with Jammu and Kashmir was a major development which changed not only India, but the way the world looked at India. In making this bold move, he signaled to Pakistan that there would be no more negotiations with it over Jammu and Kashmir. Soon after that, Mr. Modi focused on boosting the economy. He slashed corporate tax rates from 30% to 22%. And in doing so, he sent a clear signal to Indian businesses that his focus was to be on economic growth. Then in November came a huge bonus for the Modi government. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of building a Ram temple at Ayodhya. That decision ended decades of strife, argument, and debate across the country, once and for all. In December 2019, Home Minister Amit Shah pushed through the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA. What the CAA did was all the persecuted religious minorities in countries in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh were allowed to apply for Indian citizenship, and the cutoff date was December 31st, 2014. But it made one exception for Islam. It did not permit Muslims who came as religious refugees the citizenship privilege that the other communities enjoyed. This was a controversial decision. It created riots, particularly in Delhi. There was violence, but on the other side, for the Hindutva brigade, it was a plus, and their support for the Modi government grew. Just when Mr. Modi seemed unstoppable, he had to face four major crises that would take all his experience and skills to handle. The first was COVID, when it struck in March 2020. The world had never seen a pandemic like this for almost a century. It devastated countries across, and particularly India. Almost 43 million cases were reported, and almost 500,000 people died in India. Mr. Modi was initially castigated for the way he handled COVID as soon as it broke out. He imposed a stringent lockdown, and that lockdown created both misery for the people and impacted their livelihoods. We are all very familiar with the scenes that we saw of thousands of people exiting cities. Never before had we seen those sights. Probably partition was the last time that happened. And they all left and went back to their villages, some of them walking for over 1,000 kilometers. While Mr. Modi and his team would argue that it was necessary to impose such a stringent lockdown because thousands of lives were saved because of it. And also, India was ill prepared. The health infrastructure wasn't available, and they needed time to build up that infrastructure before they could ease the lockdown. Then, of course, opinion began to change because as the pandemic went on, they gained not only in terms of treatment, but also in terms of prevention, where vaccines started to be developed. But as they were doing that, the second wave struck. And again, there was tremendous criticism against the government because, as we all know, all our friends and family, we didn't have enough oxygen for them. Many people lost their lives. And all of us felt disempowered. And this did damage Mr. Modi's image. But he soon made up with his approach towards focusing on making India self-sufficient. Very soon, we not only had enough testing centers, there was treatment, there were enough beds that were there, and most importantly, we trebled the supply of oxygen through various moves. He ensured that in future, if the pandemic took a toll like this, we would never be deficient of oxygen. But most importantly, what he did was he furthered vaccine research, and India became one of the key COVID vaccine producers. And in doing so, almost 1.9 billion doses have been administered in India, and almost the entire adult population has been vaccinated. And we saw the impact of that when the third and the fourth waves, the Omicron waves struck us. The number of deaths had considerably reduced, and so was the hospitalization. And Mr. Modi even received compliments from US President Joe Biden when they met at the Quad Summit in Tokyo, where he said India had done a good job in handling the COVID pandemic. The second big crisis that Mr. Modi faced in his second term was, again, as a direct result of the COVID pandemic. The economy had collapsed, GDP growth had turned negative for the first time in 50 years. There was a huge amount of unemployment, as many people had been laid off, and particularly the informal sector, where it was estimated that almost half the number of people employed in that sector had lost their jobs. Experts say that there are four engines that are responsible for economic growth. The first is government or public expenditure. The second is exports. The third is private investment. And the fourth is consumption, what you and I consume. These four factors combine to ensure that economic growth happens in a country. What the COVID pandemic did was that it knocked out private investment because no businesses were functioning, it hurt consumption, and there were no exports. So Mr. Modi had to boost what was the fourth engine, which was public expenditure. And that he did with great measure. First, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced a rupees 20 lakh crore stimulus to enable businesses to survive. It was largely in the form of loans in terms of loan deferment, but it helped. Then for the poor, the Modi government gave free grains, pulses, and cooking oil. And that helped a lot for them to tide over the crisis. But one of the skills of Mr. Modi is that he can convert adversity to great opportunity. And this he did by bringing radical reforms in the way the economy was being run. Among the major things he did, and this was in keeping with public expenditure, he announced a program to spend rupees 100 lakh crore on infrastructure. He called it Gati Shakti. And what it meant was, from 2021 onwards, India would be spending at the rate of 20 lakh crores on building roads, on railways, on shipping, and air transport. And Gati Shakti would be a game changer because what Mr. Modi did was he brought all the ministries involved in infrastructure building together and to coordinate their efforts. This meant last mile connectivity. Just to give you an example, if they were going to build an airport or a train service, they would ensure that roads were built to that particular village or to the town so that people could then go from one transport form or one mode of transport to another seamlessly. That was important because earlier there used to be a lot of duplication and there would be missing links all over. One of the major features of Mr. Modi in his second term was his penchant for radical economic reforms. He seemed unafraid to take the big steps. Among the major reforms he brought about was to alter agriculture. No one had touched this sector since independence, and he decided that he would pass 3 farm laws that would end state control and move agriculture firmly to the private sector. While this was seen by experts as a move that could have transformed Indian agriculture that had stagnated, the farmers didn't see it that way. They carried out a year-long protest, and the government decided that if the main stakeholders were not happy with the laws, Mr. Modi felt there was no need to continue with it, and he withdrew the 3 laws. But the trajectory that he set of moving towards the private sector, not just in agriculture, but in other key sectors, would become the direction the government would take. The big push for privatization came when Mr. Modi decided that there would be no more holy cows for reform. 2 of the sectors that he opened up to private participation was space and atomic energy. Now, Space Department always had an element of private participation, but what he did was revolutionary. He said private players could now build their own rockets and satellites and use the Indian Space Research Organization to do that. Earlier, ISRO held the monopoly. In atomic energy too, there was a lot of private participation in terms of building, contributing to the reactor construction. But now they said medical reactors could be built by the private sector. There were other areas that Mr. Modi opened up. Defense was one of them. In defense, he announced that there would be an Atmanirbhar Bharat policy, which meant that most of these equipment would now be made in India, and even created limits in terms of what Indian defense manufacturers would make and what would be opened out for foreign manufacturers to come in. Many of these decisions were opposed not only by his critics, but also by his supporters in various Sangh Parivar organizations that exist. But Mr. Modi refused to relent. Then he focused on the next big engine of growth, exports. Indian exports had stagnated to a level of $300 billion or around that period for almost a decade. COVID was no time for really export reform to come, but Mr. Modi pressed ahead. He held a meeting with over 200 missions, Indian missions across the world, 40 stakeholders like export promotion councils, and sat with them and asked them what their main issues were. He then had the Union Commerce Ministry iron out all their problems. That saw merchandise exports of India go up to $400 billion, the first time it has done so in a decade, and grew by almost 30% as compared to pre-COVID levels. Having dealt with the two major crises, both originating from COVID, now let's deal with the third and fourth crisis, and these emanate from external circumstances. The first big crisis happened actually during COVID, when China, in May 2020, 2 months after COVID struck India, made major border intrusions in Ladakh, and in doing so violated almost 20 to 25 years of agreements between these two countries. For the first time since 1975, there was armed conflict between the two countries that saw loss of lives. The other major external crisis happened in February this year when Russia invaded Ukraine. It caused major shocks to the Indian economy, as it did to countries across the world. That's because Russia is one of the world's largest energy suppliers. Apart from that, Russia and Ukraine are also one of the world's largest grain suppliers and cooking oil too. For India, that meant that wholesale prices went up by as much as 15%, the first time it has done in the last 2 decades. Apart from that, cooking oil, particularly sunflower oil, went up by as much as 60%. When it came to these two external crises, Mr. Modi dealt with both of them firmly and kept India's national interest right at the center. When it came to China, apart from our military response, Mr. Modi made it clear that relations with China would not be normal till China restored status quo ante at the Ladakh heights. 15 rounds of negotiations have been held, and some of the ground that China had occupied have been returned, but there is still a lot of negotiations to happen. In the meanwhile, Mr. Modi brought international pressure on China. He revived the Quad, or the quadrilateral dialogue of 4 countries, that is USA, Japan, Australia and India, and they have now formed an economic front called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that is essentially a bulwark against China. When it came to Russia, India's stand was that there should be cessation of hostilities and respect for territorial integrity. But it abstained in the UN Security Council when various resolutions were passed by the Western countries wanting to condemn Russia for the invasion. While the US and Western countries criticized India for its decision, it had to grudgingly acknowledge that India had to keep its national interests in mind because of its dependence on Russia for much of its defense supplies. India, though, has to continue to deal with the crisis being caused by the Ukraine war. Commodity prices have gone up, so has fuel prices. And inflation is raising its ugly head, not just in India, but across the world. We saw what happened in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, where inflation actually pulled down ruling parties. The Modi government moved with alacrity to bring down prices, particularly of fuel, where petrol and diesel prices were reduced. And when it came to cooking oil, import duties were reduced. While these measures may cool inflationary trends, the big problem of unemployment remains in the country. The focus, therefore, in the remaining 2 years has to be, as one expert told me, the economy, the economy, the economy. And that means that India now not only has to allow domestic industry to grow rapidly, but it has to be part of the global value chain. That is important because the pandemic has shown that over-reliance on China was not a good thing, and they are looking for other countries as an alternative. India could fit the bill if it got its act together. For that, it requires not just central government, but state cooperation. States must improve the ease of doing business. They must make the infrastructure required for Indian businesses to grow rapidly. Only then could we start thinking of integrating with a global value chain that could bring enormous dividends once we get it going. The other major task ahead is implementation. There has been a whole lot of schemes that the Modi government has announced, not only in this term, but even in the previous term. Now is the time for delivery. The Prime Minister's personal popularity remains high. We saw that in the Uttar Pradesh elections. It was because of his campaigning that the BJP won a landslide majority. Experts say that for rapid economic growth, Mr. Modi must now focus on unifying the country. Recently, we have seen divisive elements come again, and the old issues of Mandir versus Masjid seem to have revived. These are not good trends. Religion does not feed empty stomachs. What Mr. Modi needs to focus on is not only economic growth, but income to the people, jobs to the people, and overall prosperity and peace for the country in the next 2 years. Prime Minister Modi is on the verge of becoming one of the greatest prime ministers India has ever had. He must grab this opportunity and guide India to its rightful destiny, to its rightful place under the sun. If he doesn't do that, he may be remembered as just another prime minister. Thank you for listening to Nothing But the Truth. Look forward to being with you next week.